Gaze. That is the word I want you to hold first tonight. Not as a curiosity, not as an exotic label on an ancient jar, but as a living language. A language that was still being spoken, still being copied, still being guarded, when the rest of the Christian world had already decided which parts of Noah's story were worth keeping and which parts were not. Tonight, we are opening one of the most specific disagreements in the entire history of the biblical text. Not a disagreement about theology, not a disagreement about doctrine, a disagreement about a number, 600. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came upon the earth. That line exists in almost every tradition. Genesis says it, the Septuagint echoes it, Jubilees confirms it. So what is the disagreement? The disagreement is not about the number itself. It is about what that number means. It is about where that number came from. It is about the entire system of counting that stands behind those 600 years. A system that most of the Western biblical world quietly set aside, and a system that the Ethiopian Bible kept. To understand why this matters, I need to take you to 3 different rooms in the history of the biblical manuscript tradition. 3 different rooms, 3 different decisions, 3 different versions of the same ancient man. The first room is Greek, the Septuagint room. Around the 3rd century before the Common Era, Jewish scholars in Alexandria began translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This translation became known as the Septuagint, named, according to tradition, for the 70 or 72 scholars who produced it. The Septuagint became the Bible of the early church. Paul quoted from it. The first Christians read from it. For centuries across the Mediterranean world, if you wanted to hear the scriptures, you heard them in Greek. Now, when the Septuagint translators arrived at the genealogies of Genesis, the long, careful lists of who lived how long, who begat whom, and how many years passed between the beginning and the flood, something changed. The numbers changed, not slightly. Not by a year or two, significantly. The Septuagint version of the pre-flood Patriarchs is older, much older, in several cases, by 100 years or more. Scholars have been arguing about why for centuries. Was it a scribal correction? Was it a deliberate theological adjustment? Was it an attempt to align Hebrew sacred history with the longer timelines of Egyptian and Babylonian records? We do not know with certainty. What we do know is this: the Septuagint adjusted the numbers, and when it adjusted the numbers, it broke something. It broke the internal architecture that the original counting system had been built upon, an architecture that the Ethiopian Bible still preserves, the Masoretic room. The second room is Hebrew. The Masoretic text is what most modern English Bibles translate from. The King James Bible, the NIV, the ESV. If you have read Genesis in English, you have read a translation of the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text was finalized by Jewish scholars between roughly the 7th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. Though it preserves much older material, the standardized form we use today was shaped and vowel-pointed during those centuries. And the Masoretic numbers are shorter than the Septuagint numbers. Where the Septuagint gives great age, the Masoretic often reduces it. This means that depending on which Bible you are reading from tonight, Noah's world looks different. The timeline of corruption before the flood looks different. The spacing between the patriarchs looks different. The internal logic of why the flood came when it came looks different. And in the middle of this ancient disagreement between Greek and Hebrew traditions, there is a third room, the Ge'ez room, The Ethiopian manuscript tradition did not choose between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text the way Western Christianity eventually did. It preserved something older than both debates. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, kept a canon that included books the Council of Laodicea rejected, books that Rome set aside, books that the Protestant Reformation did not inherit. Among those books was Meshrafe Kufale. Pause, let the name sit. Meshrafe Kufale. In Ge'ez, Meshaf means book. Kufale means divisions, the dividing up of time. We know this book in English as the Book of Jubilees, but that translation loses something important. The English word Jubilees points to a celebration, a release, a year of freedom. The Ge'ez name Kufale points to something more precise. Divisions, the careful, methodical dividing up of time into units that can be counted, tracked, verified. Meshave Kufale is, at its heart, a book obsessed with chronology, with getting the numbers right, with insisting that sacred history did not happen in a vague long ago, but in specific years, specific months, specific days. And it is this book, preserved in full in the Ethiopian canon, lost to fragments everywhere else, that gives us the system behind Noah's 600 years. Here is the textual clue I want to place in your hands tonight. The Jubilees calendar is not the same as the calendar most of us grew up reading. It is a solar calendar, 364 days, divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, 52 weeks exactly. No drifting, no intercalary months added to make the numbers work, no adjustment needed to reconcile the count with the moon. 364 days, every year, every time. The scholars who preserve Meshafe Kufale were not using this calendar as a religious preference. They were using it as a proof, because when you apply this calendar to Noah's 600 years, when you count the exact days from his birth to the day the waters came, the numbers align. They align with a precision that the Septuagint numbers do not achieve. They align with a precision that the Masoretic numbers do not achieve. The internal architecture of the story only becomes coherent when you count it the way Meshafa Kufale counts it. And the Ethiopian Church knew this, not as a modern scholarly discovery, as an inherited certainty. The monks who copied these manuscripts by hand, working in the scriptoria of Debre Bizan and the monasteries of Lake Tana, were not preserving Jubilees because it was old. They were preserving it because it was precise. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where the manuscript detail becomes more than academic. When the Greek Septuagint added years to the pre-flood patriarchs, it was not simply inflating numbers. It was detaching those lives from their chronological home. It was taking men who existed in a specific, counted sequence and loosening them from that sequence. And when numbers become loose, the story changes. The moral weight of the flood changes. Because in the Jubilees tradition, in the Ge'ez tradition, those 600 years of Noah's life are not 600 years of waiting around. They are 600 years of witness. 600 years of watching a world that had been given every warning and refused every one of them. 600 years of a man whose grandfather Enoch had already told the world exactly what was coming. If you shorten those years, you shorten the witness. If you lengthen them arbitrarily, you inflate them into vagueness. Only the Ge'ez count keeps Noah standing at his exact height, not a legend, not a rounded number. A man with a specific beginning, a specific calling, and a specific day when the water came. I want to stay with that name one moment longer. Meshrafe Kufale. This text was written originally in Hebrew. Scholars believe in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and it was almost certainly used within Jewish priestly circles who opposed the Greek calendar reforms being pressed upon Jerusalem from outside. The text was then translated into Greek, then into Ethiopic Ge'ez. And here is what should stump you quietly. The Hebrew original is lost. The Greek translation survives only in fragments. But the complete text, the full, unbroken, chapter-by-chapter account, survives only in Ge'ez, only in the language of the Ethiopian Church. Only because a community of scholars and monks in the highlands of East Africa decided that this precise, calendrical, chronologically obsessed book was too important to leave outside the canon, while councils in Rome were voting on which books belonged, while reformers in Europe were deciding which texts to include. The Ethiopian Church was already centuries deep into treating Meshafa Kufale as scripture, not as curiosity, not as apocrypha, as the Word of God, as the text that explains the numbers, as the text that keeps Noah's 600 years from dissolving into myth. That decision is why we still have the counting tonight. And here is what I want you to carry into the next chamber of this study. If the Ethiopian Church had not made that decision, if Meshafa Kufale had been lost completely the way it was lost everywhere else, we would not know that the 600 years belonged to a system. We would have a number with no home, a man with no calendar, a flood with no count behind it. But the Ge'ez manuscript kept the system alive. And the system has something very specific to tell us about what those 600 years actually contained, about what Noah saw during them, about who was counting, and about why the counting mattered enough to be preserved in the first place. Let me place something in front of you. Not an argument, not a theory, a system, an ancient, carefully constructed system for measuring sacred time that most of the modern world has never been taught to read. And once you see it, once you understand how Meshafa Kufale divides the years, Noah's 600 years will never look like a round number again. They will look like what they actually are, a precise address. In time, when most of us think about ancient biblical chronology, we bring our modern assumptions with us. We assume a year is approximately 365 days. We assume the calendar drifts slightly, needs adjustment, needs the occasional leap year to keep the seasons in their proper place. We assume time is a little approximate, a little negotiable. Meshafa Kufale assumes none of that. The calendar embedded in the Book of Jubilees was not built for approximation. It was built for precision, for the kind of precision that believes God does not work on a drifting calendar, that the days appointed for sacred events are not close to their proper time. They are exactly on their proper time. And if your calendar cannot keep that precision, the fault is in the calendar, not in the appointment. The 3-6-4 day year, the Jubilees calendar runs on 364 days, not 365, not 365 and a quarter, 364. Exactly 52 weeks, exactly 4 seasons, 13 weeks in each season, 91 days in each quarter. And here is the detail that matters most. Because the year is exactly 52 weeks, every sacred day falls on the same day of the week. Every year, without exception, without drift, without adjustment. The first day of the first month is always the same day of the week. The Passover always falls on the same day of the week. The Day of Atonement always falls on the same day of the week. Think about what that means for a priestly community trying to keep sacred appointments with absolute exactness. No confusion, no recalculation, No argument about whether the feast begins at sundown on this day or the next. The calendar was designed to eliminate ambiguity from sacred time, to make the appointments of God as precise as God intended them to be. And it is this calendar, this exact, unambiguous, 52-week year that Meshafe Kufale uses to count every life in sacred history, including Noah's. Now I need to introduce you to the unit of measurement that gives this book its name, a jubilee. In most English Bibles, a jubilee refers to the 50th year, the year of release, of freedom, of debts canceled and land returned. But in Meshafe Kufale, the jubilee works differently. Here a jubilee is 49 years, 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7, 49 years in one complete cycle. And within that 49-year jubilee, time is further divided into 7-year periods called weeks of years. 7 years in each week, 7 weeks in each jubilee, 49 years total. Now, the author of Meshafe Kufale does not simply tell you that something happened in a certain year. He tells you which jubilee it happened in, which week of years within that jubilee, which year within that week. Every event in sacred history has a 3-part address: a jubilee number, a week number, a year number. This is not decoration. This is the author's argument that sacred history is not random, that it is not approximate, that it is not loosely assembled from the memories of people who forgot exact dates. It is an argument that God keeps a calendar, and that calendar can be read. So where does Noah live in the calendar of Meshafe Kufale? According to the chronology of Jubilees, Noah was born in the 5th week of the 10th Jubilee. The 5th week of the 10th Jubilee. Not a long time after Adam. Not many generations before Abraham. A specific address. In the same way that a manuscript preserved in a monastery has a shelf, a codex number, a folio, a line, Noah has a location in sacred time. And that location was preserved in the gaze text of Meshafe Kufale when it had been lost everywhere else. Now watch what happens when we count forward from Noah's birth using the Jubilees calendar. 600 years, 364 days per year, 52 clean weeks per year. No drift, no adjustment. 600 years of that calendar does not land on an arbitrary point in time. It lands at a boundary, a jubilee boundary. The flood did not come in the middle of a week of years. It did not come in the middle of a jubilee. According to the precision of Meshafe Kufale, the flood came at the threshold of a new sacred division of time, as if the old order of the world had completed its appointed span, and the water came not as interruption, but as conclusion. That is not a coincidence built into an old story. That is a theological statement built into a calendar. And only the Ge'ez tradition preserved the calendar precise enough to let us read that statement tonight. Here is a question worth sitting with slowly. If this calendar system is so precise, if it aligns so carefully with the sacred events it describes, why did most of the biblical world abandon it? The answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Politics. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Seleucid rulers of the ancient Near East were pressing a Greek lunar calendar onto the Jewish people of Jerusalem. The lunar calendar. The calendar of the surrounding nations. The calendar of the empire. Many Jewish communities accepted the change or were forced to accept it. The group behind Meshafe Kufale refused. They refused not because they were stubborn. They refused because they believed that changing the calendar meant changing when the sacred appointments of God occurred. And if the appointments of God occurred on the wrong days, the worship was wrong. The feasts were wrong. The entire sacred structure of time was being dismantled by an imperial calendar that served a human empire rather than a divine order. So they wrote Meshrafa Kufale. They embedded their calendar into the history of creation itself. They showed that the 364-day solar year was not their invention. It was God's original architecture. It was the calendar of the angels. And then, the book was lost. Lost to the mainstream Jewish tradition as the lunar calendar won the political argument. Lost to the Greek Christian tradition as the Septuagint became the dominant text. Lost to the Western Church as councils decided which books belonged and which books did not. Lost everywhere, except Ethiopia. I want you to picture something for a moment. Somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, in a monastery built on rock, with walls thick enough to keep out centuries, a monk is copying Meshrafe Kufale by hand. He does not know that the Hebrew original is lost. He does not know that the Greek fragments are scattered across libraries no one has yet fully cataloged. He only knows that this book was handed to him as part of the canon, as part of what the church preserved, as part of what must be copied with the same care as the Psalms, as the Gospels, as the letters of the Apostles. So he copies it, word by word. In Ge'ez, the calendar inside it, the 49-year jubilees, the 7-year weeks, the 364-day years, the precise address of every event in sacred history, all of it moves from his pen onto the page. And somewhere in that careful, unremarkable, daily act of copying, Noah's 600 years survive, not as legend, not as approximate biography, as a number with a home, a life with a location, a man placed exactly where sacred time needed him to be placed. There is one more layer to the Jubilees calendar that I do not want to pass by too quickly. Within the 49-year Jubilee, within the 7-year weeks of years, Meshrafe Kufale observes the Shabbat principle at every level. The 7th day rests. The 7th year rests. This is the sabbatical year. The 7th week of years rests. This is the Jubilee. 7. 7 times 7. 49. And then the 50th year, or in Jubilee's reckoning, the first year of the next cycle begins again. This nested rhythm of sevens is not numerology for its own sake. It is a statement about the character of time. That time, in its sacred structure, is not linear in the flat sense we often imagine. It breathes. It moves in patterns of work and rest, of accumulation and release, of appointment and completion. And Noah's 600 years, when mapped against this breathing calendar, do not simply end at the flood. They complete something. They exhale. 600 years of a world that had been building toward a breaking point, counted out in jubilees and weeks and years, moving inevitably toward the day when time itself needed to be reset. The flood, in the language of this calendar, was not punishment landing randomly on an unlucky generation. It was the Sabbath of a world, the rest, that comes after the work of corruption has exhausted itself completely. That is what Meshrafe Kufale preserves. That is what the Ge'ez manuscript carried through 1,500 years of history while other traditions were losing the calendar that makes the sentence readable. And this is where I need to ask you to hold two things at once. The first is the system, the calendar, the jubilees, the weeks, the nested sevens, the 364 days. Hold that in one hand. In the other hand, hold a man who was born at a specific address in that calendar, a man who lived for exactly 600 years inside that counting system, a man who did not merely exist for 6 centuries, but witnessed 6 centuries, saw what those centuries contained, saw what was being built, and what was being destroyed, and what was being refused, because Meshafe Kufale does not give us the calendar in isolation. It gives us the calendar populated with people, with choices, with the slow, terrible accumulation of a world walking toward water with its eyes open. And Noah was counting the whole time. 600 years of watching. 600 years of the calendar marking its precise divisions, while the world around him refused to read them. What did those 600 years actually contain? What did he see? What did the Gez text preserve about the world that existed inside those counted years? That the shortened traditions did not think important enough to keep? That is the chamber we open next. I want to ask you something before we go further into the text, and I want you to sit with the question rather than answering it quickly. Have you ever watched something deteriorate so slowly that you could not point to the exact moment it stopped being healthy? A relationship, a community, a place you once knew that is now unrecognizable. You did not see it break. You only looked up one day and realized it had already been broken for longer than you knew. Now, imagine watching that for 600 years, not as a distant observer, not as a historian reviewing old records, as a man standing inside it, living through every decade of the decline, watching every generation make its choices, carrying the memory of how things began while witnessing what they were becoming. That is the life Meshafa Kufale gives to Noah, and it is a life most translations do not let you see clearly enough. To understand what 600 years of witness means, we have to begin at the beginning, not the flood, Noah's birth. Meshafa Kufale places Noah's birth in the 5th week of the 10th Jubilee. By that point in sacred history, the world had already accumulated a significant weight of wrong turns. Adam and Eve had left the garden. Cain had killed Abel. The line of Seth had begun its long, careful attempt to preserve something holy in a world that kept choosing otherwise. But the world Noah was born into was not yet at its worst. This is important because it means Noah did not begin his life surrounded by the full corruption that would eventually call the flood. He was born into a world that still had memory. Memory of Enoch, memory of warning, memory of what God had said through the mouths of the righteous in the generations before him. He was born into a world that still knew the truth and was already in the slow process of deciding it did not want it. That is perhaps the most painful kind of world to live in for 600 years. Not a world of ignorance, a world of chosen forgetting. Here is where the Ge'ez text does something the abbreviated traditions cannot. It names the deterioration, not in broad strokes, not in the general language of wickedness that we often find in Genesis. Meshafa Kufale moves through the pre-flood generations with the same precision it applies to everything else. It identifies specific moments when specific things went wrong, the mixing of what should have remained separate. The abandonment of the sacred calendar, yes. The calendar itself becomes a moral issue. The eating of blood, the worship of what was made rather than what made it, the teaching of practices that unmade the order God had established in the first days of creation. And across all of this, Noah is present. Not as a passive bystander, not as a man sealed inside a private holiness, untouched by what surrounded him. As a witness, a man who saw the specific chapters of the world's unraveling as they were written one generation at a time. Meshafe Kufale chapter 5 uses language that the Western translations often soften or omit. It speaks of the sons of God coming to the daughters of men, of children born from that union who became mighty in the earth, of a violence that did not arrive suddenly but grew, the way a flood does not arrive without rain. First the rain, then the rivers, then the breaking of banks, then the water over everything. Noah watched the rain for 600 years before the rivers broke. I want to slow here because this is one of the places where the gaze tradition gives us something the shortened canon cannot. Meshafe Kufale does not simply say the earth was corrupt. It tells us how it became corrupt. It tells us that the corruption followed a sequence. First came the abandonment of the appointed times. The sacred calendar was set aside. The feasts were moved. The Sabbaths were ignored. This matters more than it might first appear, because in the theology of Meshafe Kufale, when a community stops keeping the appointed times, it is not merely being religiously careless. It is losing its orientation in sacred time. It is beginning to live as though the appointments of God do not govern the days, as though time belongs to whoever is powerful enough to claim it. Second came the corruption of what was eaten. Meshafe Kufale is specific about the eating of blood, a prohibition it traces back not to Moses, but to Noah himself. Before the flood, before the law, before Sinai, the instruction not to consume blood was given, according to this text, because blood is life, and life belongs to God. When the pre-flood world began consuming what was forbidden, it was not simply breaking a dietary rule. It was asserting ownership over what it had not made and could not sustain. Third came the violence, and Meshafe Kufale is careful to show that the violence did not precede the theological corruption. It followed it. The world became violent after it had already decided that the appointments of God were optional, that the boundaries God had set were negotiable, that the life God had given could be treated as property rather than as gift. Violence was not the disease. Violence was the symptom, and Noah watched as the diagnosis became undeniable. I want to step away from the text for just a moment. Not far. We will come back, but there is something human here that deserves to be named carefully. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to people who see clearly in a world that has decided not to. It is not the grief of loss. Not exactly. It is the grief of watching, of knowing what is coming and not being able to transfer that knowledge into the people around you no matter how plainly you speak it. Noah had this grief for 600 years. We sometimes read his story and imagine him as a man apart, sealed in his righteousness, untouched by the deterioration around him. But Meshafe Kufale does not give us that comfortable distance. It gives us a man who lived inside those 600 years, who had neighbors, who had a community, who existed in the same world that was coming apart around him, and who had to find a way to remain faithful, not in isolation, but in the specific daily difficulty of living alongside people who were choosing otherwise. I think sometimes we underestimate what that costs a person. We imagine that having the truth makes the watching easier. It does not. Sometimes it makes it harder, because you cannot pretend not to see what you see. You cannot reduce it to someone else's problem. You cannot decide it is not your century, not your generation, not your grief to carry. Noah carried it. 600 years of it. And the Ethiopian Bible kept that weight in the record, kept it precise, kept it counted, kept it from dissolving into the vague wickedness of a story told too quickly. Now I want to return to the calendar, because there is a detail in Meshafe Kufale about the specific timing of the flood that most readers walk past without stopping. The flood did not come at the midpoint of Noah's 600 years. It did not come when the corruption was merely bad. It came at the end of the 6th century of his life. In the 600th year, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day, Meshafe Kufale gives us that address precisely. 2nd month, 17th day, 600th year. Why does the precision matter? Because in the Jubilees calendar, the 17th day of the 2nd month falls on a specific day of the week every time, without drift, without adjustment. The 3-6-4 day calendar ensures it. The flood did not arrive on whatever day happened to follow a sufficient accumulation of sin. It arrived on an appointed day, a day that had been embedded in the structure of sacred time before Noah was born, before the corruption began, before the first generation made its first wrong choice. The flood was not a reaction. It was a completion. The world had been given its full span of appointed time, and the appointed time had run its course. And only the Gaze calendar lets us see the appointment clearly enough to understand that. Meshafa Kufale uses a phrase about Noah that I want to sit with carefully tonight. It describes him as a man who was perfect in his generations, not perfect in an abstract, untested sense, perfect in his generations, inside the specific generations he lived through, inside the specific corruption of his specific centuries, inside the particular pressures of the particular world that existed during his 600 years. That phrase is doing important work. It is not saying Noah was untouched by difficulty. It is saying he remained faithful despite being thoroughly touched by it. The perfection the text speaks of is not the perfection of distance. It is the perfection of endurance. And here is what makes that remarkable in the context of Meshafe Kufale's calendar. Every year of Noah's life was a year the calendar marked. Every jubilee that passed was a jubilee during which Noah was present, watching, counted, remaining. The calendar did not exempt him from the weight of what surrounded him. It simply kept recording that he was still there, still faithful, still counted, still the man whose address in sacred time placed him exactly where God needed a witness for exactly this long. There is a quiet tragedy embedded in the history of this text. When Meshafe Kufale was removed from the canon in most of the Christian and Jewish world, when the calendar it preserved was replaced by the lunar calendar of empire, what was lost was not merely a book. What was lost was the ability to read the precision of Noah's story. Future generations would still have the 600 years, but they would no longer have the system that gave those years their meaning. They would have the number without the home, the address without the city, the man without the calendar that explained why his life was exactly as long as it needed to be. And this is why the Ethiopian Church's decision to keep Meshafa Kufale in the canon was not merely a theological preference. It was an act of preservation that protected the precision of a story the rest of the world was in the process of losing. The monks who copied this text were not preserving an interesting alternative tradition. They were keeping the calendar alive, and the calendar kept Noah's witness alive. But there is still something we have not opened. Something that sits at the edge of Noah's 600 years like a locked door, because the world that Noah witnessed did not deteriorate on its own. The corruption of those pre-flood centuries had a specific origin, a specific moment when something entered the world that should not have entered, something that Meshafa Kufale describes in detail that made later church councils deeply uncomfortable, something that the Ethiopian Bible preserved anyway. Because the Ethiopian Church understood that you cannot properly understand the flood without understanding what made the flood necessary. You cannot understand Noah's faithfulness without understanding what he was faithful against, and you cannot understand what he was faithful against until you open the record that Meshafe Henoch preserved, the Book of Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, the man who walked with God and did not die. The man who saw, before Noah was born, exactly what was coming, and left a record of it that the rest of the world tried very hard to forget. There is a book that sits in the Ethiopian Bible tonight that does not sit in yours, not because it was unknown, not because the early church had never read it, not because it was considered irrelevant or poorly written or spiritually suspect by those who first encountered it. It was removed, deliberately, systematically, by councils that had decided its content was too specific, too detailed about things they would have preferred to leave vague, too precise about events that were easier to manage as metaphor than as recorded history. The book is called Meshafa Henok. Meshafa Henok. In Ge'ez Meshaf, as we have learned, means book. Henok is Enoch, the book of Enoch. And tonight, it is one of the most important texts we will open together, because it is the book that explains the world Noah was born into. In most Western Bibles, Enoch appears briefly. Genesis chapter 5 gives him a handful of verses. We are told he walked with God. We are told he lived 365 years. We are told he was taken by God and was no more. That is the entire record in the shortened canon. A man who walked with God. A man who did not die. A man who disappeared. But in the Ethiopian Bible, Enoch has an entire book, 68 chapters in the version most scholars work from today, 108 chapters in the complete Ge'ez manuscript tradition. Meshafa Henok is not a footnote to Enoch's story. It is Enoch's testimony, what he saw, what he was shown, what he recorded before he was taken from the earth. And what he recorded was a warning addressed specifically to the generation of the flood, to Noah's generation, to the people who would have every reason to know what was coming and choose not to listen. In chapter 6 of Meshafa Henok, the text opens a door that makes many later readers uncomfortable. It names 200 beings called the Watchers. The Watchers. In Ge'ez, the tradition uses terms that carry the sense of those who observe, those who remain awake, those who were appointed to watch over creation from above. Meshafa Henok tells us that these Watchers looked upon the daughters of men and made a decision that was not permitted, a decision that crossed a boundary established in the order of creation itself. They descended. They took wives from among the daughters of men, and the children born from this crossing of boundaries were the Nephilim. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is a place where sensation can replace substance if we are not paying attention. The point of this record is not spectacle. The point is what the descent of the Watchers did to the world, what it introduced, what it taught, what it unleashed into the generations that followed. Meshafa Henok, chapter 8, gives us a list. And this list is one of the reasons the book was removed from most canons, because it is specific. The Watchers did not merely arrive and cause chaos. They taught. They transmitted knowledge to humanity that humanity had not been given and was not yet equipped to carry. The text names specific Watchers and assigns to each of them a specific area of forbidden instruction. Azazel taught the making of weapons, the cutting of metals, the crafting of instruments that could multiply human violence far beyond what human hands alone could accomplish. Others taught enchantments, the reading of roots, the cutting of particular plants for purposes that subverted the natural order of cause and consequence. Others taught the observation of stars in ways that became the foundation of what later generations would call divination, the attempt to read the future through the created order rather than through the creator. Now notice what is happening here. None of these things are neutral. Every piece of forbidden knowledge the Watchers transmitted was knowledge that shifted human attention away from dependence on God and toward dependence on technique. Weapons made violence more efficient. Enchantments made manipulation more accessible. Celestial divination made the creation appear to be the source of answers rather than the one who made it. The Watchers did not simply corrupt humanity through moral failure. They corrupted humanity through misdirected knowledge. They made the world more sophisticated and less dependent on God at the same time. And Meshafa Henok records that this process took place across the generations that Noah would spend his 600 years watching. The children of the Watchers, the Nephilim, are described in Meshhafe Henoch with a specificity that Genesis only gestures toward. They were mighty. We are told that in Genesis, but Meshhafe Henoch tells us what that might look like on the ground. It looked like consumption. The Nephilim consumed everything the earth produced. When the earth could not sustain their appetite, they turned to the people. When the people were exhausted, they turned against each other. The violence of the pre-flood world was not simply human wickedness scaled up across generations. It was the natural consequence of a world that had been filled with beings of extraordinary power and no corresponding order to govern that power. And Noah watched this. He watched from his birth in the 10th Jubilee through every decade of the world's unraveling. He watched a world that had been given wisdom use that wisdom for consumption. He watched a world that had been given strength use that strength for domination. He watched a world that had been given knowledge use that knowledge to cut itself free from the one who had given it. And he remained, counted, present, faithful, inside the precise calendar of Meshhafe Kufale, alongside the recorded testimony of Meshhafe Henoch. Noah's 600 years were not years of vague waiting. They were years of specific witness to a specific unraveling that had a specific origin and a specific appointed end. Here is one of the most striking details in the entire Meshhafe Henoch tradition, and it is a detail that most readers encounter without fully stopping. Enoch's visions and warnings in Meshhafe Henoch are not addressed to his own generation. They are addressed to a remote generation, a future generation, a generation of sinners who would not read his words until after he was gone. Chapter 1 of Meshhafe Henoch makes this explicit. Enoch says, "Not for this generation do I speak these words, but for one that is distant, for the elect who will live in the day of tribulation." Think about what that means. Enoch wrote his testimony before the corruption had fully ripened. He wrote it knowing that the people around him did not yet need the warning in its full weight. He wrote it for the generation that would be standing at the edge of the flood, for the generation of Noah. He preserved his testimony so that when the time came, when the world had reached the fullness of what Meshhafe Henoch described, there would be a record that said, "This was seen before it happened. This was named before it became undeniable. This was preserved so that no one in the generation of the flood could claim they had not been warned." And the Ethiopian Bible preserved that record, while the rest of the biblical world removed it. While councils decided it was too specific, too detailed, too cosmologically uncomfortable to keep in the canon, the Ethiopian Church said otherwise. It said, "This warning was given. It should be remembered. It should be read. It should be counted alongside the rest of what God preserved for the world to know." I want to place this in proper historical weight. Meshhafe Henoch, the Book of Enoch, was known and cited by early Christian writers. Tertullian referenced it. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament quotes it directly. For the first few centuries of the Church, the Book of Enoch was not considered fringe material. It was considered ancient testimony, sacred record, a window into the world before the flood that no other text could provide. Then the councils met, and one by one, the Book of Enoch was pushed outside the boundaries of what was considered canonical. The reasons were multiple. The cosmology was too detailed. The angelology was too specific. The account of the Watchers raised questions that certain theological frameworks preferred not to address directly. So the book was set aside, except in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never participated in the decision to remove it. Not because they were unaware of the councils, not because they were isolated from the debates, because they had inherited a tradition that understood Meshhafa Henoch as inseparable from the rest of sacred history. You cannot understand Genesis properly without understanding what Enoch recorded. You cannot understand the flood without understanding what preceded it. You cannot understand Noah's 600 years without understanding the specific world those years contained. And the complete text of Meshhafa Henoch, the full 108 chapters of Enoch's testimony, survives today only in Ge'ez manuscripts, only in the language of the community that refused to let it go. Now, I want to connect these two texts in a way that matters personally. Noah was not born into ignorance about what was happening in his world. He was born into a family that carried Enoch's testimony. His great-grandfather had walked with God. His great-grandfather had been shown the history of what was coming. His great-grandfather had left a record specifically for the generation that would live through the flood. That means when Noah watched the world unravel, he was watching something his great-grandfather had already described. He was not discovering the corruption as a surprise. He was recognizing it. The way you recognize a thing you have been warned about but hoped would not come true. There is a particular grief in that recognition. Enoch had said it would happen. Meshhafa Henoch had preserved the saying, and now Noah was watching it happen exactly as described. Not because prophecy is mechanical, not because the future is fixed in a way that removes human responsibility, but because the pattern of a world that has decided to refuse God is not mysterious. It is readable. Enoch read it before it fully arrived. Noah watched it arrive. Meshhafa Henoch preserved both testimonies, and the Ethiopian Bible kept both books in the same canon so that we could read the connection that the rest of the world's traditions had separated. And so we arrive at a specific question that the text now places before us. If the world had been warned by Enoch, if the warning had been preserved in Meshhafa Henoch, if Noah himself carried that family memory through 600 years of watching the warning become reality, then when did God speak to Noah directly? When did the instruction come? Not the general knowledge that the world was wrong. The specific instruction, the precise moment, the precise month, the precise day. When did God say, "Now, the time has come. Here is what you must do. Here is exactly when. Here is how the count ends." Because Meshhafa Kufale does not leave that moment vague. It does not say God spoke to Noah and told him to build an ark and left the timing to approximation. It gives us the date, the precise calendrical address of the moment when 600 years of witness became the threshold of everything that was about to change. And that precision tells us something about God that the shortened traditions did not preserve clearly enough to see. Let me give you a date. Not an approximation, not a general season, not a vague in those days. A date. The 17th day of the second month of the 600th year of Noah's life. That is when the flood came. That is the address Meshhafa Kufale gives to the most significant act of divine judgment in the pre-Abrahamic world. Not a season, not a year, not even a month. A day. The 17th day of the second month. Now, most readers who encounter this date in Genesis read it as biographical detail, a marker in Noah's life, a way of establishing that the narrator knew something specific about when things happened. But Meshhafa Kufale does not treat this date as biography. It treats it as theology. And the difference between those two readings is the difference between a number and an argument. When we say a date is theological rather than merely biographical, we mean something precise. We mean that the date was not chosen because that happened to be the day the rain began. We mean the date carries meaning within the calendar system that governs sacred time. We mean that someone, or someone, chose that day because of what that day was within the structure of the appointed calendar. In the 364-day solar calendar of Meshafa Kufale, the 17th day of the second month falls on a Wednesday. Every year, without exception, without drift. Wednesday, the 4th day of the week, the day on which, according to the creation account preserved in Jubilees, God created the lights of heaven, the sun, the moon, the stars, the day on which the instruments of time itself were placed in the sky. The flood began on the same day of the week that time was created. Let that sit for a moment. The waters that unmade the world arrived on the day that the lights governing time were first set in place. This is not coincidence arranged by a narrator who enjoyed symbolic patterns. This is a theological argument embedded in a calendar. The God who created time acts within time at appointed moments. The flood was not a reaction to sufficient provocation. It was a kept appointment. Meshafe Kufale does not give us only the day the flood began. It gives us the full chronology of everything that followed. The flood came on the 17th day of the second month. The rain continued for 40 days and 40 nights. This we know from Genesis. But Meshafa Kufale continues counting where Genesis grows approximate. The waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. The ark rested on the mountains of Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month. Notice something. The flood began on the 17th day of the second month. The ark rested on the 17th day of the 7th month, 5 months apart. Both on the 17th, both anchored to the same day number within their respective months in the 364-day calendar of Meshafe Kufale. This means both days fall on exactly the same day of the week. The flood did not begin on one kind of day and end on another. It began and ended on the same appointed day of the week, as if the entire event from the first rain to the resting of the ark was contained within a single sacred bracket. Open bracket, 17th day, second month, close bracket, 17th day, 7th month. The world was unmade, and the ark came to rest within a symmetry of sacred time that only the Ge'ez calendar preserves precisely enough to see. Here is the quiet tragedy I want you to understand clearly tonight. The dates are still in Genesis. The 17th day of the second month, it is there. The 17th day of the 7th month, it is there. The Western canon did not remove the dates. It removed the calendar that makes the dates speak. Imagine inheriting a letter written in a specific code. The letter is intact. Every word is present. Every number is still in place. But the codebook that explains what the numbers mean has been set aside. You can read the words. You can see the numbers. But you cannot hear the argument the letter is making. That is precisely what happened to Noah's flood chronology in the Western biblical tradition. The dates survived. The calendar that decodes them did not. And so, for centuries, readers in the Western tradition looked at the 17th day of the second month and saw biography, while readers in the Ethiopian tradition, still carrying Meshafe Kufale, still working within the 364-day calendar, still counting the jubilees and the weeks, saw theology, saw God who does not act randomly, saw a world whose destruction was appointed before the corruption that caused it had fully ripened, saw a calendar in which even judgment has a precise and purposeful address. I want to stay with this question because it is not merely academic. Why would God be precise about the timing of judgment? Why does it matter that the flood came on a specific day of a specific month of a specific year? Why not simply say when the time was right, the water came? The answer that Meshafe Kufale implies is uncomfortable in its beauty, because precision in judgment is an act of justice. A judgment that arrives randomly can be dismissed as chaos, as accident, as the violence of an arbitrary universe. but a judgment that arrives on an appointed day, in an appointed month, in the appointed year of the witness who had been counting all along, is a statement. It says, this was not arbitrary. This was not random. This was not an overreaction to a bad century. This was the completion of a span of time that had been given fully and freely to a world that used every year of it to confirm its refusal. 600 years, not 500, not 700, 600. Every jubilee counted, every week of years marked, every appointed day recorded. And on the day the 600th year arrived at its second month, at its 17th day, the appointment was kept, not by the world, by God. The world had broken every appointment given to it. God kept the final one. That is not a small theological statement. That is the argument Meshafe Kufale has been building since its first chapter. That sacred time is real. That appointments are real. That the God who sets them does not forget them when the world decides it has moved on. There is one more layer of precision in the flood narrative of Meshafe Kufale that deserves to be opened carefully. The instruction to build the ark was not given to Noah at the last moment. Meshafe Kufale places the instruction within the counted years well before the flood arrived. Noah was given time, specific time, counted time, time within the calendar to prepare what needed to be prepared. And the dimensions of the ark in the Jubilees tradition are not presented as Noah's architectural decision. They are presented as received instruction, precise instruction for a precise vessel, to carry a precise number of lives through a precisely appointed event. Nothing in the flood narrative of Meshafe Kufale belongs to approximation. Not the timing, not the vessel, not the duration, not the resting place. Every element of the flood is embedded in the same calendar that has been counting since the first day of creation, and the Ethiopian Bible preserved all of it, while the rest of the tradition kept the story but lost the precision that makes the story say what it was always meant to say. I want to name something here that sits quietly beneath the surface of everything we have been opening. In the theology of Meshafe Kufale, the calendar is not merely a tool for organizing time. The calendar is covenant language. When God establishes the 364-day solar calendar in the opening chapters of Jubilees, He is not setting up a scheduling system. He is making a statement about the relationship between the Creator and created time. He is saying, I will act within this framework. I will keep appointments within this structure. The sacred events of history will occur on days that mean something within this calendar. And when a community abandons that calendar, when it replaces it with a lunar calendar that drifts, that requires adjustment, that cannot guarantee the same feast day will fall on the same day of the week year after year, Meshafe Kufale treats that abandonment as more than a practical change. It treats it as a breaking of covenant language, as a decision to stop reading time the way God wrote it. The Ethiopian Church understood this, not as a calendar argument for its own sake, as a preservation argument. If you lose the calendar, you lose the ability to read the precision of what God recorded in sacred history. You lose the 17th day's meaning. You lose the symmetry of the flood's brackets. You lose the Jubilee boundary at which Noah's 600 years conclude. You lose the argument that judgment is not random but appointed. And so the monks copied Meshafe Kufale, generation after generation, in the highland monasteries, in the scriptoria of Aksumite Christianity, in the careful, unremarkable daily labor of preservation. They kept the calendar alive, and the calendar kept the precision alive, and the precision kept the argument alive. That God counts, that God appoints, That God keeps what the world dismisses as expired. And so we have arrived at a specific threshold. We have the calendar. We have the system. We have the precise dating of the flood. We have the theological argument embedded in the 17th day. We have Enoch's warning. We have the Watcher's record. We have the counted years of a world that was given every tool to read its own appointed time and refused every one of them. But there is still something we have not fully opened, something that sits at the very center of why Noah's 600 years matter as more than chronology. Because numbers, even precise numbers, do not explain themselves. A calendar can tell you when. It cannot tell you what it meant to live inside the when. 600 years is a timestamp, but it is also a testimony. And testimony is not mathematics. Testimony is what a witness carries in the part of himself that cannot be fully written down. The part that remembers not just what happened, but what it cost to keep watching while it happened. Noah's 600 years were not 600 years of waiting for something to end. They were 600 years of being present to everything the world was choosing. 600 years of a man who could not look away, who was not permitted to forget, who was required, by the very nature of what he had been called to be, to remain a faithful witness to an unfaithful world. That is not a small thing to ask of a human life, and the Ethiopian Bible preserved the record of it with enough precision to let us feel the weight of it tonight. What those 600 years actually were, what they contained, what they asked of the man who lived through every one of them. That is the chamber we open next. There is a word in the Ge'ez tradition that I want to give you carefully tonight. Not quickly. Not as a definition to be filed away. Carefully. The word is tamim. Tamim. It is a Hebrew word carried into the Ge'ez tradition through the deep roots of Ethiopian biblical scholarship. It means complete, whole, without blemish, sound in every part. And it is the word Meshafe Kufale uses to describe Noah. Not righteous only, not obedient only, not morally careful only. Tamim, complete. But here is the line I do not want you to pass too quickly. The text does not say Noah was Tamim in isolation. It says he was Tamim in his generations. In his generations. Inside the specific generations he was given to live through. Against the specific corruption of his specific centuries. Amid the specific refusals of the specific people who surrounded him across 600 years. His completeness was not abstract. It was demonstrated, proven in context, tested in time, counted across jubilees. And the Ethiopian Bible preserved that phrase precisely enough that we can still feel what it is asking us to understand. Noah's faithfulness was not simply a private moral achievement. It was a public witness, lived out loud, against the grain, for 600 years. I want to think carefully about what that means for a human life. Because we use the word witness in many ways. We use it lightly sometimes, as if witnessing is simply a matter of being present when something happens. But in the tradition of Meshrafe Kufale, in the theological vocabulary that the Ethiopian Bible preserves, witness is not passive. Witness is active, costly, requiring something from the person who bears it. A witness must remain present to what they are witnessing. They cannot look away. They cannot decide that what they are seeing is no longer their concern. They cannot reduce the evidence of their senses to something more comfortable than what is actually in front of them. A witness must see clearly. And clear seeing is one of the most demanding things a human life can be asked to do for 600 years. Because clear seeing means you cannot pretend that the world is improving when it is not. You cannot tell yourself that the corruption is temporary when the calendar of jubilees is showing you its accumulation decade by decade. You cannot decide that the warnings of Enoch were relevant to another generation, but perhaps not quite to yours. Clear seeing requires you to remain honest about what is in front of you. And honest seeing, sustained across 600 years without the comfort of denial, is a form of faithfulness so demanding that most of us will never be asked to carry it at that scale. Noah was. Meshafe Kufale does not romanticize Noah's 600 years. It does not give us a man sealed in a private holiness so complete that the world's deterioration could not reach him. It gives us a man who was in his generations, not above them, not insulated from them, not protected by his righteousness from the grief of watching what his righteousness could not change. There is a particular kind of sorrow that belongs to faithful witness. It is not the sorrow of personal failure. It is not the grief of someone who made wrong choices and must live with the consequences. It is the sorrow of someone who made right choices and still had to watch the world make wrong ones. Noah could not transfer his faithfulness to his neighbors. He could not make the generation around him read the calendar of Meshafe Kufale and understand the appointment they were approaching. He could not press Enoch's warning into the hearts of people who had decided the warning did not apply to them. He could only remain Tamim, complete, present, counted, inside the years that the world was spending on its own refusal. And that is a specific grief. A grief the Ethiopian Bible kept in the record. A grief that the shortened tradition softened by removing the precise counting that lets you feel how long the faithfulness had to last. 600 years is not a number designed to impress. It is a number designed to make you feel the length of the witness. I want to step close to something for a moment. Something that is not about manuscript tradition or calendrical systems or canonical history. Something that is simply human. Most of us will never be asked to be faithful for 600 years. But most of us have known a smaller version of what Noah carried. The experience of seeing clearly in a room where others have decided not to. The experience of remaining when the easier choice would have been to reduce what you see to something less uncomfortable. The experience of carrying a truth that the people closest to you have decided they do not want. And the experience of wondering quietly, honestly, whether the faithfulness is worth it, whether the clear seeing is a gift or a burden, whether the witness you are bearing is being recorded anywhere by anyone who understands what it is costing you. Meshafe Kufale has an answer to that question. It is not a loud answer. It does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives in the form of a calendar that counted every year Noah lived. Every jubilee he passed through, every week of years he endured, every 17th day of every second month of every year that moved him forward through the 600 years of his appointed witness. The calendar counted him, even when no one around him was counting in the same way, even when the world was too busy with its own deterioration to keep proper track of the man in its midst who was remaining faithful. The calendar of sacred time kept the count, and the Ethiopian Bible kept the calendar, so that tonight, across 1,500 years of manuscript tradition, across the careful hands of monks who copied what they were given, we still know that Noah was counted, that his witness was recorded, that the 600 years were not lost in the noise of a world that did not want to hear them. They were preserved precisely, carefully, in the language of Ge'ez, in the canon of a church that understood that a life counted precisely is a life that cannot be erased. Here is what I want you to understand about the relationship between Noah's 600 years and the flood that ended them. The flood did not make Noah's witness meaningful. His witness was already meaningful, already counted, already recorded in the calendar of Jubilees year by year across 6 centuries. The flood confirmed it. It confirmed that the world Noah had been watching was exactly what he had seen it to be. It confirmed that Enoch's warning had been accurate. It confirmed that the calendar was not a religious formality, but a living record of appointed time moving toward an appointed completion. And it confirmed something about Noah himself that no human court could have confirmed, that a life can be tamim, complete, whole, without blemish, inside the most broken generations the world has ever produced. That faithfulness is not dependent on the faithfulness of the world around it. That a witness can remain a witness even when no one is watching and no one is listening, and the calendar keeps counting year after year through jubilees that feel like they will never end. Noah's 600 years are the Ethiopian Bible's testimony to that truth. Not as inspiration, not as distant legend, as counted record. And this is where I need to place something in your hands directly. Something that is the center of everything we have opened tonight. The reason the Ethiopian Bible preserved Noah's 600 years with the precision it did. The reason Meshafe Kufale kept the calendar. The reason Meshafe Henoch kept the warning. The reason the Gaze tradition refused to set aside the books that made the counting legible. The Ethiopian Bible did not preserve 600 years because it was careless with numbers. It preserved them because it understood that a life counted precisely is a life that cannot be erased by the silence of those who refuse to listen. That is not a small statement. It is the argument that runs beneath every manuscript decision the Ethiopian Church ever made about what to include and what to preserve. When they kept Meshafa Kufale in the canon, they were saying, the precision matters, the counting matters, the calendar matters, because if we lose the precision, we lose the testimony. And if we lose the testimony, we lose the record that a faithful human life was present and counted and real inside the most faithless centuries the world had ever produced. The 600 years are not lost tonight. They are here, in the Ge'ez text, in the Ethiopian canon, in the careful, preserved, century-by-century transmission of a church that understood what was at stake if the counting stopped. Noah was counted. The flood was appointed. The calendar was kept. And the Ethiopian Bible carried all three truths across 1,500 years of history to this moment, when we can finally read them together the way they were always meant to be read. But there is still one more chamber in this archive that we have not entered, because the flood was not only an ending, it was also a carrying. Noah did not merely survive the waters, he carried something through them. Not only his family, not only the animals, not only the biological continuity of a world that needed to begin again. He carried knowledge, the knowledge that Enoch had recorded, the calendar that Meshafe Kufale preserved, the testimony of 600 years of faithful witness in a faithless world. He carried all of that into the ark, and the ark carried all of that through the water. And what came out the other side was not merely survival, it was preservation. The Ethiopian Bible understands this. It understands that the ark was not only a vessel for living things, it was a vessel for what living things had been given to know, for what faithful generations had been given to remember, for what the counted years of a witnessed history had accumulated into the care of one man who was Tamim, and who carried it all through the only water the world had ever seen fall all at once. What the ark preserved beyond the bodies inside it, that is the chamber we open next. Picture the ark, not as a children's illustration, not as a rounded boat filled with cheerful animals 2 by 2. Picture it as what Meshafa Kufale describes it to be. A sealed vessel, dark inside, the sound of water on every surface, the world outside in the process of being unmade. And inside that sealed vessel, one family, Noah, his wife, his sons, their wives, 8 people. Above them, water. Below them, water. Around them on every side, the sound of what happens when an appointed judgment arrives at its appointed day. Now, what did they do in there? What did 8 people do inside a sealed ark while the world outside was being returned to the condition it existed in before God separated the waters on the second day of creation? Genesis does not tell us. It tells us they entered. It tells us the rain came. It tells us the waters rose. It tells us the ark floated. But what happened inside during those 150 days of water? Genesis is silent. Meshchafe Kufale is not. Meshrafa Kufale, chapter 7, opens a door that Genesis leaves closed. It tells us that Noah did not enter the ark, carrying only his family and the animals and the provisions for survival. He carried knowledge, specific knowledge, inherited knowledge, the accumulated understanding of everything the pre-flood righteous had been given to preserve. The calendar, the 364-day solar calendar that Meshchafe Kufale had established as the sacred structure of appointed time. Noah carried it into the ark. Because a calendar is not written on stone that survives a flood. A calendar is carried in the mind and memory of the people who practice it. If Noah had not carried the calendar through the water, the calendar would have drowned with the world that abandoned it. The sacred appointments, the feast days, the Sabbath cycles, the Jubilee structure, the weeks of years, all of it transmitted orally, carefully, from Noah to his sons, inside the sealed vessel while the water did its work outside. The dietary laws. Meshchafe Kufale records that Noah received specific instruction about what could and could not be consumed, about the prohibition of blood, about the boundary between what sustains human life and what belongs to God alone. This instruction in the Jubilees tradition was not given at Sinai. It was given to Noah before the flood, and it was transmitted to his sons inside the ark during the flood, so that when the water receded and the door opened and the world began again, the knowledge was still intact, still whole, still counted, still carried by the 8 people who had come through the water with more than their bodies. Here is the shift I want you to feel carefully. Most of us understand the ark as a survival vessel. Its purpose, in the common telling, was to keep alive what the flood would otherwise have killed. Bodies, breath, biological continuity, and that understanding is not wrong. But Meshchafe Kufale adds a second layer to the ark's purpose that changes the weight of the whole story. The ark was also a transmission vessel. It did not merely keep bodies alive, it kept knowledge alive. The knowledge of sacred time, the knowledge of appointed worship, the knowledge of what God had given to the pre-flood world through Enoch, through the righteous line of Seth, through the careful, counted generations that had preserved the truth while the world around them refused it. All of that knowledge needed to cross the flood, and it crossed in the memory of Noah, in the instruction he gave his sons while the water held them, in the oral transmission of a calendar, a set of appointments, a body of covenantal understanding that could not survive outside of human custody. The ark was a library, a sealed, floating library carrying the inheritance of 600 years of faithful witness through the only catastrophe large enough to have erased it completely. And Meshchafe Kufale preserved the record of that transmission. Preserved what was carried, preserved how it was carried, preserved the instruction that Noah gave his sons while they waited for the water to complete its appointed work. Now, I want to make a connection that I believe the Ethiopian manuscript tradition has always understood implicitly, even when it has not always stated it in these exact terms. The Ge'ez canon of the Ethiopian Bible is a second ark, not metaphorically, in a loose sense, not as a pleasing image for a late-night script. Structurally, functionally, In terms of what it was asked to carry and what it preserved against the flood it was given to survive. The first ark carried living things through physical water. The gaze canon carried living knowledge through the flood of historical erasure. When the Council of Laodicea removed Meshaphe Henoch from the canon, the water rose. When the mainstream tradition set aside Meshaphe Kufale, and with it the 364-day calendar and the Jubilee counting system, the water rose. When the Hebrew original of Jubilees was lost, when the Greek translation survived only in fragments, when the centuries accumulated their weight of institutional decision against the texts that preserved the precision of Noah's story, the water rose. And the gaze manuscripts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church were the ark that floated above it, sealed, preserved, carrying what the flood of erasure could not reach. As long as the monks kept copying, the church kept canonizing, the tradition kept treating these texts as scripture rather than curiosity. The parallel is not incidental. It is the heart of why the Ethiopian Bible matters so specifically to the story of Noah. Not simply because Ethiopia preserved old books, because Ethiopia preserved the same kind of thing that Noah preserved in the ark. Knowledge that was given to the faithful. Knowledge that the surrounding world decided was not worth keeping. Knowledge that would have been lost completely if one community had not sealed it inside their canon and carried it through the water. Meshapha Kufal, chapter 7, gives us specific content of what Noah transmitted inside the ark. He told his sons about the calendar. He explained the 364-day year, the Jubilee structure, the weeks of years, the importance of keeping the sacred appointments on their correct days. He warned them against the corruption that had destroyed the world they had just left. He named specifically the sins that Meshaphe Henoch had recorded, the sins of the Watchers, the eating of blood, the abandonment of appointed times. He told them, "This is what destroyed everything. Do not repeat it. Do not allow your generations to drift back into what our generations just watched the flood undo." And this is the detail that sits most quietly in the text. He told them to write it down. Meshaphe Kufale records that Noah instructed his sons to preserve what they had been given, not to carry it only in memory, not to trust that faithfulness would automatically transmit itself to the generations that followed, to write it, to record it, to give it a form that could outlast the memories of the people who received it. Noah understood something that the Ethiopian manuscript tradition would spend 1,500 years proving correct. That knowledge given to the faithful must be actively preserved or it will be lost. That the flood of erasure does not arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, generation by generation. One canonical decision at a time. One set-aside text at a time. One council vote at a time. And the only defense against it is the same defense Noah employed. Get in the ark. Carry what you were given. Transmit it to your sons. Tell them to write it down. There is a Gez word I want to give you here. Tamhart. Tamhart. It means teaching, instruction. The transmission of knowledge from one who holds it to one who needs to receive it. It is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses for the sacred act of passing understanding forward, not merely information, not merely facts transferred from one mind to another. Tamhart carries the sense of living transmission, knowledge that arrives with the full weight of the tradition behind it. Knowledge that knows where it came from and insists on being received with the same seriousness with which it was given. When Noah spoke to his sons inside the ark, he was performing Temhort. When the monks of the Ethiopian highlands copied Meshaphe Kufale and Meshaphe Henoch into fresh Ge'ez manuscripts, they were performing Temhort. When the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church placed these books in its canon and told its congregations, "This is scripture. This is what we have been given. This is what must be preserved," It was performing Temhort, the chain of transmission from Noah to his sons inside the sealed ark. Runs unbroken through 1,500 years of Ethiopian manuscript tradition to the guy's text that still exists tonight. That is not a spiritual metaphor. That is the literal history of how these books survived. Through Temhort, through the faithful transmission of knowledge that the world kept deciding it did not need. I want to end here with a single image, not a concept, not a theological argument, not another layer of manuscript history. An image. The flood has been falling for 40 days. The water has been rising for 150 days. And now the rain has stopped. The water is still rising, but the violence of it is over. And the ark is floating on a surface so vast that there is no horizon to find, just water in every direction, under a sky that is beginning to remember what blue looks like. And inside the ark, Noah is speaking to his sons, not dramatically, not with the voice of a prophet delivering a thunderous word, quietly, the way a father speaks when he knows that what he is saying is the most important thing his children will ever need to hear. He's telling them about the calendar, about the jubilees, about the appointed times, about the prohibition of blood, about the warning of Enoch, about the 600 years he spent watching a world make every wrong choice that a world can make. And his sons are listening, because outside the ark is nothing but water, and inside the ark is everything that survived. The Ethiopian Bible preserved that moment, that quiet, floating, water-surrounded moment of a father telling his sons what must not be forgotten. It preserved it in Ge'ez. It preserved it in the canon. It preserved it through 1,500 years of monks and councils and institutional decisions that said, this belongs. This is scripture. This must not be lost. And because they said that, we are inside the ark tonight, floating on the same water, receiving the same Temhort, the same transmission that Noah gave his sons when the world outside was still too wet to stand on. But the ark eventually rested. The water eventually receded. The door eventually opened. And the question that Meshafe Kufale leaves us with as the flood ends is not only what was preserved, it is who preserved it. Because the transmission that Noah began inside the ark did not travel in a straight line to the Ethiopian church. It traveled through centuries of institutional decisions, canonical debates, political pressures, and the slow drift of one tradition after another away from the precision Noah had insisted on. And somewhere in that long and complicated history, one community held. One church in the highlands of East Africa kept the calendar when everyone else lost it, kept the books when everyone else set them aside, kept the count when everyone else stopped finding the precision necessary. And the question we need to open now is, why? What was it about the Ethiopian church, its history, its theology, its specific relationship with these specific texts that made it the one community capable of being the second ark? That is what we open next. There is a question that has been moving beneath this entire study, like a current beneath still water. We have seen what the Ethiopian Bible preserved. We have opened Meshafa Kufale and found the calendar. We have opened Meshafa Henok and found the warning. We have followed Noah's 600 years through the precision of the Jubilees counting system. We have watched the ark carry knowledge through the flood. And we have understood that the Ge'ez manuscripts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church are the second ark, the vessel that carried what the first ark preserved through 1,500 years of institutional erasure. But we have not yet asked the most important historical question. Why Ethiopia? Of all the places where ancient Christianity took root, of all the communities that inherited the earliest texts, Of all the churches that had access to the books the later councils would set aside, why did Ethiopia become the one community that kept them? The answer is not simple, but it is specific, and it begins with a matter of timing. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church received Christianity in the 4th century of the Common Era. Specifically, scholars trace the formal Christianization of the Aksumite kingdom to approximately 330 CE. Through the work of Frumentius, known in the Gaze tradition as Abba Salama, Father of Peace, the Aksumite court embraced the Christian faith. Now, here is the date that matters. The Council of Laodicea, the council that formally established the boundaries of the Western Christian canon and excluded books like Jubilees and Enoch, met in 363 CE. 363 CE, 30 years after Ethiopia had already received its canon. The Ethiopian Church did not receive Christianity and then have books removed from its canon by a later council. It received Christianity before the council met. Its canon was established on a foundation that included Meshafe Kufale and Meshafe Henoch as scripture. And when the Council of Laodicea made its decisions about what belonged in the Christian canon, those decisions were the decisions of a Western council, applying to Western churches in the Western theological and political sphere. The Ethiopian Church was not in that sphere, geographically, politically, theologically. It was in the highlands of East Africa. It was the established religion of the Aksumite kingdom. It had its own theological tradition, its own liturgical language in Ge'ez, its own inheritance of texts, and it saw no reason to accept a Western council's decision about which books its God had given it to keep. This is the first reason Ethiopia kept what Rome forgot. Rome's decision came too late to change what Ethiopia had already received. But timing alone does not fully explain it, because there were other early Christian communities that also predated the Council of Laodicea. The Church in Alexandria, the Church in Antioch, the Church in Jerusalem, all of them ancient, all of them established before 363 CE. And yet none of them preserved Meshafa Henoch in canonical completeness the way Ethiopia did. So why Ethiopia specifically? The answer lies in the specific character of Aksumite Christianity. The Aksumite kingdom, the ancient empire whose capital was the city of Aksum in what is now northern Ethiopia, was not a peripheral outpost of Mediterranean Christianity. It was a major civilization, one of the great trading empires of the ancient world, a kingdom with its own coinage, its own monumental architecture, its own sophisticated relationship with the texts it inherited. And crucially, it had a deep, pre-Christian relationship with Jewish scripture. The tradition of the Ethiopian Church holds that the connection between Ethiopia and the Hebrew biblical tradition goes back further than Christianity, back to the time of Solomon, back to the tradition of the Ark of the Covenant preserved in Aksum, back to a community of people who had been reading and preserving Hebrew scripture for centuries before Frumentius arrived. When Christianity came to Ethiopia, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a community that already had a relationship with ancient biblical texts. A community that already understood what it meant to preserve sacred writing, to copy it carefully, to treat it as the living Word of God rather than as historical artifact. And when that community received Meshafe Kufale and Meshafe Henoch as part of its Christian inheritance, it received them into a tradition that already knew how to keep things. There is a third factor that most Western accounts of Ethiopian Christianity present as a disadvantage, but which was, in terms of manuscript preservation, one of the most important advantages the Ethiopian Church possessed: geographic isolation. The highlands of Ethiopia are not easy to reach. The terrain is dramatic. The political history of the region made sustained outside influence difficult to maintain. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, the Ethiopian Church found itself increasingly surrounded by a different religious world. Trade routes shifted, political alliances changed. The easy flow of influence between Ethiopia and the Mediterranean Church became more complicated, and something unexpected happened as a result. The Ethiopian Church was left alone with its texts. No ongoing council pressure to conform its canon to Western decisions. No sustained institutional influence from Rome or Constantinople, insisting that certain books be removed from the scriptures the Ethiopian congregations read. No political incentive to trade away Meshafe Henok for a seat at a table that was several thousand miles away and increasingly inaccessible. The isolation that might have weakened the Ethiopian Church's connection to mainstream Christianity paradoxically protected its connection to ancient texts that mainstream Christianity was in the process of forgetting. The monks kept copying in the monasteries of Lake Tana, in the scriptoria of Debre Bizan, in the highland communities that had inherited these texts and understood them as sacred. They copied Meshafe Henok. They copied Meshafe Kufale. They copied the full breadth of the Ethiopian biblical canon, 81 books, where the Protestant tradition has 66, where the Catholic tradition has 73. They copied because that is what you do with the Word of God. You preserve it. You transmit it. You perform temhort across every generation that passes through your monastery. I want to give you one specific place tonight. Debre Bizan. Debre Bizan. In Ge'ez, Debre means mountain or monastery. Debre Bizan is one of the great ancient monasteries of Ethiopia, located in what is now Eritrea, established in the 4th century CE, one of the oldest, continuously functioning Christian monasteries in the world. For 1500 years, the monks of Debre Bizan and communities like it across the Ethiopian highlands have been copying, preserving, and transmitting the Ge'ez manuscript tradition, not as archivists preserving artifacts, as believers preserving scripture. The distinction matters enormously. An archivist preserves because something is old. A believer preserves because something is true. The monks of Debre Bizan did not keep Meshfa Henok because it was an interesting ancient document. They kept it because it was the testimony of Enoch, the man who walked with God, and the testimony of Enoch was scripture, was temhart, was the living inheritance of the faithful that could not be surrendered without surrendering the truth it carried. That conviction that these texts were not curiosities but canon is what kept the manuscripts alive through every century that the Western world was forgetting they existed. In 1770, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce arrived in Ethiopia. He was not primarily a biblical scholar. He was looking for the source of the Nile. But what he found in the ancient libraries of Ethiopia changed the history of biblical scholarship. He found complete Ge'ez manuscripts of Meshafa Henok, the Book of Enoch, in full, intact, 108 chapters. He brought copies back to Europe, and for the first time in roughly 1,500 years, Western scholarship encountered the complete testimony of Enoch, not fragments, not quotations preserved by accident in the margins of other texts. The complete book. The response was remarkable. Scholars who had known only the brief references to Enoch in Genesis and Jude suddenly had access to a text that transformed their understanding of the pre-flood world, of the Watchers, of the theological context in which early Christianity had developed. The Book of Enoch had not disappeared because it was unimportant. It had disappeared from everywhere except Ethiopia, and it returned to the Western world from Ethiopia. From the Ge'ez manuscripts that the monks had kept through 1,500 years of copying and preservation and institutional faithfulness to a canon that the rest of the world had decided was too much. The second ark had held its cargo. And when the water receded, when the historical moment arrived that allowed the knowledge to return to the wider world, it came out of Ethiopia, exactly the way knowledge came out of the first ark, intact, preserved, ready to be transmitted to a world that had forgotten what it had lost. I want to close this section by returning to where we began tonight, to Noah, to his 600 years, to the number that the Western tradition kept without understanding. The reason that number 600 still has its precision tonight is because the Ethiopian Church kept the calendar that makes the numbers speak. The reason we know the 17th day of the second month was a Wednesday is because Ethiopia kept Meshafe Kufale when Rome set it aside. The reason we know what the pre-flood world contained, what the Watchers taught, what Noah's great-grandfather warned, is because Ethiopia kept Meshafe Henok when the Western councils voted otherwise. And the reason we can read Noah's 600 years as testimony rather than biography, as a calendar address rather than a round number, as the precise, appointed, theologically weighted span of a faithful human witness inside the most unfaithful world the earth had ever produced, is because somewhere in the highlands of East Africa, a monk who believed that these words were sacred picked up his pen and copied them. Again, that is why Ethiopia kept what Rome forgot. Not because Ethiopia was more sophisticated, not because its scholars were more careful, not because it had access to information that other communities lacked, because it had a conviction that the Western councils had traded away in exchange for institutional consensus. The conviction that precision matters, that counting matters, that a life measured exactly is a life that cannot be erased, that a calendar preserved carefully is a calendar that can still speak 1,500 years later to a world that lost it, that an ark, whether made of wood or made of Gay's manuscript pages, is worth building, worth sealing, worth carrying through whatever flood the world produces to erase what it does not want to remember. No one knew that. The Ethiopian Church knew that. And tonight, the texts they both preserved are still here, still precise, still counted, still carrying the 600 years that the world almost lost. And now, the archive has given us what it came to give. We have opened the calendar. We have counted the years. We have heard the warning of Enoch. We have watched the flood arrive on its appointed day. We have felt what the ark carried beyond the bodies inside it. We have understood why Ethiopia became the second ark. And now, the study lamp does not need to burn any brighter. The manuscript has been read. The count has been completed. 600 years, preserved in Gez, carried through the flood of erasure. Still precise enough tonight to tell us something true about a man, a calendar, a God who keeps appointments, and a church that understood what it was guarding. The archive room does not need to stay loud. It can grow quieter now, the way water grows quiet after the appointed time has been fulfilled. The way the surface of the flood went still when the rain stopped and the ark floated in the silence of a world that had been returned to the care of the faithful. That stillness is what comes next. The water has gone still. That is the image I want to leave at the threshold of rest tonight. Not the rain, not the rising, not the days of water pressing on every side of the ark. The stillness after, the particular silence that arrived when the appointed time was fulfilled, when the rain had done what it came to do, when the flood had completed the work it was given, and the surface of the water became flat, quiet, holding the ark the way a hand holds something precious, without gripping, without strain, just holding. That is where we are now. The archive has given us what it came to give tonight. The calendar has been opened. The count has been completed. The 600 years have been read in their precision. The Ge'ez manuscripts have carried their cargo to the shore of this hour, and now the lamp does not need to burn any brighter. I want you to picture one moment from the flood narrative, not the beginning of the rain, not the rising of the water, not the ark lifting from the ground as the flood took it. The moment the rain stopped. Meshafe Kufale counts 40 days of rain, 40 days of sound, 40 days of water striking the wooden surface of the ark from above, and then silence. The rain simply stopped, not gradually, not trailing off into drizzle. The appointed 40 days were complete. The rain had fulfilled its count, and it stopped. Inside the ark, Noah would have heard the difference immediately. The sound that had been constant for 40 days and 40 nights. The rhythm that had become the only sound in the world, gone, and in its place, nothing. The vast, water-covered, rain-finished silence of a world held between what it had been and what it would become. I think that silence must have been one of the strangest sounds Noah ever heard. Not frightening, not uncertain, completed. The silence of something that has arrived exactly where it was going. That is the silence available to us now. The 600 years are still there. We do not have to hold them as something fragile that will dissolve if we stop concentrating. They are written in Ge'ez. They are preserved in the canon. They are carried in the manuscripts that the monks of the Ethiopian highlands spent 1,500 years copying with the same quiet faithfulness that Noah spent 600 years keeping in a world that refused it. The count is done. We do not have to keep counting. The calendar of Meshafe Kufale does not require our vigilance to remain precise. It was precise before we arrived tonight. It will be precise after we rest. The 17th day of the second month does not need us to remember it in order to remain the day it was. The Jubilees do not need our continued attention to remain counted. The 600 years do not need our wakefulness to remain preserved. They are already held in Ge'ez, in the canon, in the ark of the Ethiopian tradition that carried them here. We can rest inside that holding without losing anything we found tonight. Let the image become simple now. The ark, floating on still water. The rain finished. The count completed. The appointed time fulfilled. Inside the ark, 8 people, and the knowledge Noah carried through the flood, and the calendar that counted every day of the crossing, and the testimony of Enoch that had been preserved for exactly this moment, the moment when the faithful came through the water intact. The ark is not moving. It does not need to move. The water is carrying it without effort, without direction, without any requirement from the people inside that they keep working to stay afloat. The ark holds them. The water holds the ark, and the silence holds everything. That is what is available to you now. Not the effort of the crossing, not the weight of the counted years, not the precision of the calendar, or the detail of the manuscripts, or the history of why Ethiopia kept what everyone else forgot. Only the stillness that comes after the appointed work is done. The archive lamp is growing lower now, not going out, only finding the particular warmth that a lamp has when it is no longer needed for reading, when the pages have given what they came to give, when the scholar has set down his pen, and the manuscript has been closed with the careful reverence it deserves, and the room is allowed to become simply a room again, quiet, warm, held by the same darkness that holds every honest hour of rest. The Ge'ez text is still there. The 600 years are still counted. Noah is still Tamim, still complete, still whole inside the generations that the Ethiopian Bible refused to let the world forget. None of that leaves with the lamp. It remains the way truth remains after the conversation about it has grown quiet. Not louder in the silence, just there, steady, holding its own weight without asking anything from you. The water has gone still. The archive has closed its last chamber for tonight. The manuscript has been read as far as it needed to be read in this hour, and the rest that comes after reading, the rest that comes after counting, the rest that comes after 600 years of witness have been honored with the attention they deserved. That rest is yours now, not earned by effort, not reached by striving, simply available. The way the stillness of the flood was simply available to Noah when the rain stopped and the ark floated and the appointed time had been completely, precisely, calendrically fulfilled. Let the water hold you. The count is done. The years are still there. 600 of them, counted in Ge'ez, preserved in the Ethiopian canon, carried through the flood of historical erasure by a church that understood what it was holding. Still there. You do not have to hold them. They are already held. Let the numbers rest now. Let the calendar fold quietly back into the manuscript where it has always lived. Let the jubilees settle into their ancient order. 7 years, 7 weeks, 49 years, complete, and grow still. You have heard the count. That is enough for tonight. Picture Noah now, not in the middle of the flood, not in the long years of watching, not in the weight of 6 centuries of faithful witness to an unfaithful world. Picture him after. The ark has rested on the mountains of Ararat. The door has been opened, and Noah is standing at the threshold between the ark and the new world. The water is receding slowly. The ground is beginning to appear in the places where the flood has already pulled back. The sky above him is the color of something that has been washed clean. He is not running. He is not speaking. He is simply standing at the threshold of everything that comes next, breathing the air of a world that has been returned to the care of the faithful. That is the image. Let it be quiet. The Ethiopian Bible still holds the 600 years tonight. The monks who copied them are long returned to the earth. The monasteries that preserved them are still standing in the highlands of East Africa. The Ge'ez language that carried them is still spoken, still read, still used in worship by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church every week. Nothing that we open tonight has been lost again. The calendar is intact. The jubilees are counted. The testimony of Enoch is preserved in full. The 17th day of the 2nd month still falls on the day it falls on. The flood still arrived at its appointed time. And Noah is still Tamim, still complete inside the generations that the Ethiopian Bible refused to surrender. All of it is still there, resting in the Ge'ez text the way the ark rested on the still water when the rain was done. You do not need to tend any of it. It does not need your wakefulness to remain preserved. It has been preserved through 1,500 years without your help, and it will remain preserved through whatever comes next without your effort. You can let it rest, and rest with it. The room around you is ordinary now, in the best way. Ordinary not as emptiness. Ordinary as a place no longer required to carry more than it can hold. The large things have returned to their proper home in the ancient text. The weight of 600 years has settled back into the Ge'ez manuscript where it has always lived. And what remains here in this room, in this hour, is simply the quiet that comes after something true has been honored. Let the body remember that it is allowed to be heavy now, not the heaviness of burden, the heaviness of rest, the honest weight of a frame that no longer needs to hold itself upright against anything. The jaw can loosen, the breath can slow, the thoughts that were sharp can soften at their edges without losing what they found. The 600 years are not in your mind tonight. They are in the text. Safe, precise, still counted. You are simply here, beneath them, at rest. If you need one more image before sleep comes, let it be this. Noah is not ascending. He is not counting. He is not watching the world deteriorate or warning anyone or carrying the weight of 600 years of witness that nobody wanted to hear. He is at rest. The flood is behind him. The ark has done its work. The knowledge has been transmitted to his sons. The calendar has been preserved. The testimony of Enoch has been carried through the water. Everything that needed to cross has crossed. And Noah is simply still. A man who was counted. A man who remained tamim through every jubilee the world gave him to live through. A man who carried what the world almost lost through the only flood large enough to have erased it, and who now rests on the other side of the water, in the quiet of a world that has been returned to its proper beginning. That quiet is here too, in this room, in this hour, in the space between this breath and the next. The same stillness that held the ark on the calm water after the rain stopped. Wide enough for everything. Demanding nothing, holding without gripping, just still. The archive is quiet. The manuscript has been closed with the care it deserves. The lamp is low, not dark, only low enough that the room no longer asks for reading, only low enough that what was found tonight can settle into memory without needing to be rehearsed. The 600 years are still there. They were there before tonight. They will be there tomorrow, written in Ge'ez, counted in jubilees, preserved in the canon of the church that became the second ark. You do not have to carry them. You only had to hear them, and you have. So let the hearing be enough now. Let the knowing be enough. Let the stillness that always existed beneath the counting rise slowly to the surface of this hour. The way the earth rose slowly through the receding water after the flood, quietly, steadily, returning to itself. The page is still there. The line is still there. The old record still keeps its count. And now, you may rest beneath what it preserved. The water is still. The years are still there. And this hour is yours. Quietly, faithfully, without end. Good night.